In 1865, a Cuban cigar factory invented the podcast. One worker sat on a raised platform, elevated above the rolling tables so everyone could hear, and read novels out loud. All day, every day, while hundreds of people worked in silence around him. The workers voted on what got read. They paid the reader from their own wages, and the books he chose didn't just entertain them, they radicalized them. You know the cigar brand Montecristo? That name didn't come from a marketing team. It came from the factory floor, from workers who loved the Count of Monte Cristo so much they named the cigar after it. This is the story of the factory Lector, and it's one of the strangest, most fascinating, forgotten professions I've ever come across on this channel. Hey, welcome to Forgotten Trades. I'm your host, and this is the channel where we dig into the jobs that history quietly retired, the professions that kept the world running before the modern age made them invisible. Quick note before we get into it. Today's topic touches on labor history and political movements. I'll give you context, not opinions. Everything here is drawn from the historical record, so take it as the fascinating story it is. Here's what we're covering today. First, how the role of the lector actually started, and why it was one of the most democratic inventions in the history of work. Second, what they actually read, and the morning to afternoon rhythm that shaped the entire culture of the Cuban cigar factory. Third, the books that started a revolution, and why factory owners tried to silence the readers. And finally, the detail that gets me every time I think about it. This job isn't fully extinct. It still exists. Today. Stay with me through point 3, because when I tell you what happened when factory owners tried to ban the lectors, you won't believe the response. Let's go back to Havana, 1865. Cigar rolling was skilled, repetitive, and quiet. Workers sat at long wooden tables for 8, 9, 10 hours a day, doing the same fine hand movements over and over. No radio, no headphones, no background noise except the soft rustle of tobacco leaves. A union organizer named Saturnino Martinez had an idea. What if one person read aloud, so the rest didn't have to work in silence? The first cigar factory reader was officially installed at the El Figaro factory in Havana in 1865. And the way the system worked is what makes it genuinely remarkable. The workers didn't ask management to provide a lector. They didn't wait for permission. They elected one from among themselves, voting for whoever they thought had the clearest voice, the best delivery, the most presence. Then they paid that person directly, pooling a small amount from each worker's weekly wages. Think about that for a second. These were working-class men and women who weren't making a lot of money, and they collectively chose to give some of it to one colleague, not to do any physical labor, but purely to read to them, because they decided that was worth paying for. That's not just a quirky historical footnote. That's a genuinely radical act of self-organization. And the cigar factory reader they chose wasn't just anyone. The lector was expected to perform, to modulate their voice for different characters, to handle dense political prose in the morning and dramatic fiction in the afternoon. It was part town crier, part actor, part university lecturer, and the workers held that person to a high standard because they were paying for quality. Here's how a typical day at a lector-equipped factory actually ran. The morning session was for news and current events. The factory lector would read aloud from the major newspapers, Cuban papers, but also Spanish, American, and European ones when they could get them. Political speeches, labor bulletins, essays, whatever was circulating in the world of ideas that week. Then, after the midday break, the afternoon shifted entirely. That's when the novels came out, and not light reading. The workers at these factories were consuming Tolstoy, Zola, Victor Hugo, Alexandre Dumas. These were long, serious, often politically charged works of literature, and the lectors read them in installments, day after day, chapter by chapter, the way we might follow a serialized podcast today. The workers didn't just listen passively. They debated what they'd heard. They had opinions about characters. They argued about plot. There are historical accounts of workers calling out to the lector, asking him to reread a passage or to slow down during an important scene. The Count of Monte Cristo was a particular favorite, and that's where the Montecristo cigar name comes from. Workers at those factories loved that story so much. Edmond Dantes, the wrongful imprisonment, the long, slow arc of justice, that when they needed a name for a premium cigar line, they reached for the one that meant something to them, the name that had filled their afternoons for years. That's the Montecristo cigar name, hiding a piece of labor history in plain sight. Every time you see that brand, you're looking at a monument to factory readers. Now, here's the part that makes this more than just a charming story. Remember, the morning sessions were for current events and political texts. And as the labor movement grew through the late 19th century, those texts got more pointed. The lectors were reading Karl Marx, Peter Kropotkin, anarchist and socialist pamphlets, the kinds of ideas that were actively reshaping working-class politics across Europe and the Americas. And it worked. Cuban cigar workers became some of the most politically organized, most literate, most ideologically coherent labor groups in the Western Hemisphere. Historians who've studied this period often point to the lectores as a significant reason why. When you spend 8 hours a day listening to sophisticated political theory read aloud by someone who's good at it, it gets in. The factory owners noticed. In Cuba, attempts were made to restrict or ban the lectors, and the workers responded with strikes. They walked out to defend their readers. The cigar factory reader wasn't a luxury or a novelty to these workers. He was a colleague they had hired, and the right to keep him was a line they were willing to hold. When Cuban cigar manufacturers moved operations to Florida, particularly Tampa and Key West, in the late 19th century, they brought the lectors with them. The tradition crossed the water. By the early 1900s, there were active lectores de tabaquería operating in American cigar factories, reading to largely Spanish-speaking immigrant workforces. Florida factory workers were listening to the same novels, the same newspapers, the same political texts. The practice in the United States faded in the 1930s, largely due to pressure from factory management and the rising presence of radio. In Cuba, the tradition held longer. Here's the part that genuinely surprised me when I first researched this. Most of the jobs we cover on Forgotten Trades are fully extinct. They existed, they served a purpose, and then technology or economics made them obsolete. The lector seemed headed that way. Radio arrived, then recorded music, then every portable audio format you can think of. But the lector didn't fully disappear. In Cuba, a small number of cigar factories still employ lectors today. The tradition has UNESCO recognition as part of Cuba's intangible cultural heritage. Some of the workers in those factories have never known a workspace without a reader. It's simply part of what the job is. The lector is one of the very few pre-industrial professional roles that actually survived the 20th century. Not as a museum piece or a reenactment, as a living, functioning job. Someone gets paid right now, in 2024, to sit on a raised platform in a Cuban cigar factory and read novels out loud to people making cigars. If that's not a story worth telling, I don't know what is. A couple of things that often come up when people first hear about this. First, the lector wasn't a manager or an employer's hire. I want to be clear about that because it's easy to assume the factory owner set this up as some kind of productivity scheme. They didn't. The workers organized it themselves, paid for it themselves, and chose the reader themselves. Management often tolerated it, sometimes opposed it, but they didn't create it. Second, this wasn't unique to Cuba in the sense that reading aloud in workplaces had existed in some forms before. But the formal, elected, worker-funded, daily program structure that emerged in Cuban tobacco factories was its own distinct invention. Researchers who study this history are careful to note that the Cuban model was institutionally unique. It had rules, structure, and democratic accountability that made it genuinely different from someone just reading to their colleagues informally. So, let's bring it together. In 1865, Cuban cigar workers invented a system where one elected colleague sat on a raised platform and read to them all day. Mornings for news and politics, afternoons for literature. They paid him from their own wages. They chose what got read, and through the lectors, they became one of the most politically aware labor forces of their era. The factory lector wasn't just entertainment. He was a democratic institution the workers built for themselves. When owners tried to take that away, workers went on strike to protect it. The Montecristo cigar name isn't a piece of branding. It's a small monument to afternoons spent listening to Dumas on the factory floor. And right now, today, somewhere in Cuba, a lector is sitting on a raised platform, reading a novel out loud. One of the only people in the world still working a job that hasn't changed in over 150 years. That's the kind of history I think is worth knowing. If you found this interesting, there's a lot more where that came from on Forgotten Trades. Next up, resurrectionist to surgeon. 5 disgusting jobs that became respected professions. That one goes places you might not expect. Hit subscribe if you want more stories like this. We go deep on the jobs history forgot, and there are a lot of them. Drop a comment below. What's a forgotten profession you'd want me to cover? I read every one. I'll see you in the next one.